Feeling fresh. Okay, so we're about to discuss a really, really big topic, disinformation, which we all know is a threat to democracy as well as human lives. And so we're going to first get into an understanding of the work that our subject matter expert does. So tell us a bit about the work that your company and yourself have done over the last few years.
Thank you so much. So the GDELT project that I founded is really about this idea of how we can look across the global information landscape, especially news media, and across over 400 languages now, spanning online, print, radio, television, imagery, and try to catalog what's happening around the world. And a lot of what's so fascinating about that is when you start looking at the world at that scale, you can start seeing the earliest glimmers of falsehood begin to emerge, and you can actually start seeing them, and they start colliding, and like galaxies, they take little pieces from them. So that's why this topic is so interesting and fascinating to me.
Now, the term disinformation and misinformation are used very interchangeably, but there is a distinction. Could you just give our audience a quick overview about what that distinction is?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of different terms that are tossed around here. So you have, typically misinformation. It typically is used to refer to inadvertent falsehoods, things that you weren't maliciously trying to mislead people with. Disinformation tends to be things where you're maliciously trying to drive a narrative there. And that's where you see a lot of state, a lot of governmental, we think about sort of the information warfare, that tends to be disinformation. So it's a subtle distinction, but it really captures that when we talk about the spread of falsehoods around the world, it's not always malicious. It's not always someone trying to mislead. A lot of it, like if you look at imagery that's shared on social media, a lot of times this is someone, there's some event happening, they see some image going by, they grab it and they share it and say, hey, this is what's happening. They didn't mean to mislead. They were just misinformed.
Now, a few years ago, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, launched an industry-wide campaign to get media organizations and technology companies to work together to fight disinformation, particularly around elections and other sensitive events. We're going to get onto that. And one of our former Director Generals, his name's Tony Hall, has described fake news as a poison in the bloodstream of societies. So we are going to focus in a bit on the media aspect, since obviously that's our expertise. So first of all, this is a very fast-moving space, right? How have the channels being used in the spread of disinformation evolved over the last 5-10 years?
It's really fascinating. To me, if you go all the way back a century ago, in the United States, the rise of radio. So in the U.S., when radio, as it began to emerge, newspapers actually began fighting back hard against radio because they said, look, it's fine if it's entertainment, music, etc. But if it's news, that's a problem. Because let's say something major occurs, all of a sudden people will be hearing that in real time as it's occurring, and actors that are directly involved in the event might begin commenting in real time. And that means that there won't be time for vetting and verification of the information. You won't have time to spend potentially days sifting through and figuring out. It'll just be real-time, real information. Which, it's kind of funny as we think about the rise of social media, that's exactly what's happened. All of those fears have really been materialized. And it's really interesting also the intersection between social media and mainstream media. So a couple years ago, we worked with First Draft group that focused on dis and misinformation for training for journalists. And we looked specifically at the intersection of specifically Twitter and Donald Trump. So Donald Trump, he tweeted a lot, obviously. But one of the things that we did is we scanned television news in the United States for appearances of his tweets. And so we could actually take, every time one of his tweets showed up, we could actually see that, and we tracked it back to the original tweet. And then we looked at whether Twitter had debunked the tweet. So in other words, had they flagged that tweet and said this tweet is false. And what we found was, when he would say a lot of falsehoods, they wouldn't go anywhere, except when Twitter actually put the effort to debunk it. Now all of a sudden, it got a ton of news cycles. And he actually learned that over time. So what you'd see is, he would actually tweet a falsehood, and then immediately the entire day's news cycle would be about that falsehood. And this actually raises that fascinating question. what do you do about falsehoods? Do you actively debunk them and give oxygen to something that's already kind of fading away? Or do you just kind of, let it fade? Because with the danger that if you say, this isn't really going anywhere, we're not going to do it, and now all of a sudden it's roaring forward, it's a hard thing to, to counter at that point. And so this is a really interesting question, how all these different media now are intersecting. Because oftentimes we talk about social media or mainstream media, like radio, television. We talk about them in isolation. The reality is, this is this giant cauldron that's spinning around, mixing all of this together with so many different players.
Goodness, I remember those days well, the cable news cycle. And during the pandemic as well, a very difficult time for many people across the world and in America. Research from the Reuters Institute on COVID newsreach showed that less privileged parts of the population are less likely, by quite a bit, to turn to news media than their more privileged counterparts. And news avoidance, and again, the rise of social media means there's a lot of people who are vulnerable who are taking in false or fake news. Now, I want to explore the who. Who are the people or groups behind these accounts and operations? Is it too simplistic to break it down between good guys versus bad guys?
It's fascinating when we talk, especially with the dis and misinformation boundary, because if you think about disinformation, that's usually maliciousness, and that could be a state actor trying to drive narrative around Ukraine or Gaza or one of these. It could also be a lot of commercial actors, like a lot of the crypto scams and things that are out there. Misinformation is more interesting. You see, a lot of that is just ordinary people that share things that are wrong, and this is one of those pieces that. Here's a great example that I love to cite. So when Donald Trump, after he was inaugurated and took control of the government, some of you may have heard of all these alt Twitter accounts that came out. The alt national parks, alt commerce department, alt this, alt that. What's so fascinating about this, essentially what happened was, a wave of new Twitter accounts all came about that all used the official logos of those government agencies. They looked exactly like the real account. They just had the word alt in there. And they would say, like, this is the real account. Don't trust the other account. Now, what's so fascinating about that is this is actually a really classic case of how misinformation spreads. So a huge swath of the academic and scientific community said, look, we don't know who's behind these accounts, but they must be real because they're countering the government, the government we disagree with. And what's fascinating is a number of prominent misinformation researchers actually retweeted tweets from these and said, you've got to look at this, these brave people standing up. And we talked to some of them afterwards, said, we don't know who it is, but this wouldn't be malicious. And then those accounts start fundraising. They start collecting money. And to me, what was so interesting is you saw this huge swath that normally is countering misinformation that was actually embracing it because it matched their viewpoints. And I think oftentimes we say, well, I can't be affected by falsehood because I'm educated, I'm watching the news, I keep myself informed. But the problem is, oftentimes if it disagrees with us, then it's falsehoods and I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. But if it agrees with me, a lot of times I'm just not even going to try and verify. I'm going to say, well, of course it's true, and run with it. I think this is a fascinating point there.
I like that word swamp, because social media these days really has become quite a murky swamp to dig through. And with the exponential growth of AI technologies, it's becoming even more difficult. So we know AI is disrupting almost every industry out there, especially media. And so let's talk about the risks. What are the risks around AI being used to hyper expand the spread of disinformation?
AI is really one of the things that frightens me, is that, a couple of years ago I was asked about the earliest deepfake technology, and I said, this stuff is scary, but you really have to be skilled to use these tools. These are command line tools that require a lot of hardware, etc. The scary part to me now is the mass availability and ease of use. You can pull out your phone, download some of these tools, and run them right in your phone. And the really scary part about AI is, I'm not a Photoshop expert. I'm not an artist. If you ask me, make some image about Donald Trump being tackled and arrested by the police, I couldn't do that. But this is one of the scary parts. These tools are so fast now that you see waves of, like, a major news event will occur, and then a flood of false imagery will spread. And you look at that particular case of Donald Trump being arrested. That was actually, I think, fan imagery that was put out. But it got embraced, and all of a sudden, people start picking up saying, oh, my God, he was actually arrested. He was running down the street. They were tackling him. Pope in the puffer jacket, all these things. And a lot of these, like the Pope in the puffer jacket, that didn't start as an attempt at misinformation. That started on a fashion site of, oh, this is a cool image. And then it got recycled. It moved and moved and moved, the telephone game. And then, in the original sense, in the original source, they said, look, this is just a cool computer-generated image. But then it got recycled and recycled to all of a sudden it lacked that original context. And so that's one of the things that also I think is a powerful countermeasure to some of this, is a lot of the falsehoods start as benign, and then they get put in a new context. And so if you were to say, hey, here's all this material and track it back to its source, so if you take, for example, an image that surfaces right now and says, this image is from Gaza right now, one of the things that we do is we do a reverse image search and see, has that image ever appeared on the web? And if it has, we can see the captions and the context in which it appeared. If it hasn't, then, this question of, could we trace it back to image generators? Now, the other interesting part is regulation. So the commercial image generators, many of them are putting safeguards in to prevent a lot of non-consensual imagery, a lot of, public figures and so on. The danger is, I kind of liken it to the 1990s with the encryption debate. For those of you that remember, in the 1990s, the U.S. said, we're going to restrict encryption. And if you want to export it, so I had a startup at the time. I was in 8th grade and had a startup. And we had to, you actually need a government license to have a software with encryption that left the United States. And this idea was, we control it, no, encryption will not spread across the world. Of course it did. And the same thing with image generation, with generative AI now. Even if certain governments regulate it and say you can't use it for bad things, the cat's out of the bag. These tools are open tools. Anyone can download and use them today. And those tools, in fact, there are many tools that advertise no safeguards. Use it to do this specific thing. So like text generators. The majority of the major commercial text generators, if you say, make me an email, a phishing email that will target someone from this company, it'll say, sorry, I can't do that. There are actually legitimate models that are actually sold today that you can download that are specifically designed for that very purpose. And I think the fact that they can generate them at scale and personalized. So right now, yes, I could hire Photoshop experts. I could hire writers and say, send out thousands of spam email, phishing emails to a company. With generative AI, I can just go to LinkedIn, find every single employee there, grab their profiles, hand it over, and in seconds generate millions of hyper-personalized, customized emails. And this is a really scary thing.
Definitely gives me the heebie-jeebies. Now, we've also had a few mentions of former President Trump. We are heading into a US election and possibly a UK election next year. And for those who switched off at the time, during the last election cycle, QAnon, an online conspiracy movement that turned into what some people call a global digital pandemic, really grabbed headlines, and there was a lot of influence online there. To borrow a phrase from a BBC Radio 4 podcast, it was, QAnon is basically a cabal of satanic pedophiles who may or may not have tried to steal the US election. Are you worried about next year, given everything we've discussed so far, where we have two very important democracies going into an election cycle amid very delicate geopolitical sensitivities?
Absolutely. And generative AI plays a role in this. So, for example, let's say a video comes out today that shows President Biden tripping on something. Most of us, we wouldn't immediately say, well, that can't possibly be the case. We'd actually believe that because it's happened. And I think that's where the stuff that's really scary is. As you get to that core part of the election, a video comes out with, say, Donald Trump saying something very harmful to a particular group. You could believe that. That video will go out there. And even if major news organizations say, look, this is false, we've demonstrated that this is false, etc., that doesn't help matters because people are still going to believe it. They're going to believe that something real is being censored to try to hurt or help a particular candidate. And so I think what you're going to see is a flood of individual actors, of some state actors, but I think you're just going to see a flood of ordinary people that are going to just put out tons of false information. And specifically the voice cloning and the video stuff is what really scares me. So right now, there's been a rise, an actually really, really rapid rise of tools that you could take just just tens of seconds, in some cases just a handful of seconds of someone's voice and clone them. And so you can just write a script and it will read it. It will even say in sort of the intonation and prosody that they use. And so, and this is, you've probably read some of this with some of the ransomware stuff where someone will get a phone call, it's their child, in their child's voice, saying, hey, I'm kidnapped, I need a ransom money, etc. And there's been some, and these are parents saying, God, that's actually is my child. And so I think what you're going to see is, someone in their basement's going to cook up a video of Biden or Trump or someone saying something, put that out there. The social media company, the news organizations will debunk it. The social media companies will remove it. By the time they remove it, 1,000 new videos will come up. And so I think this flood of information where you don't know what's real, what's not real, all these customized emails, all this customized information that comes out, I think that's going to be a really key. What's going to be really interesting, though, and we've already seen this in some countries, is where a politician is legitimately actually videoed by a civilian saying or doing something terrible, and they're simply able to dismiss it as, oh, that's a deep fake. That was not really me. And so this, I think, is going to be really, 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 really scary. And imagine, if there's time to debunk it, maybe, but imagine it's election morning and a video emerges of something really catastrophic. Like, you can imagine that actually swinging, especially a close election as ours may be.
All right, I want to throw this to the audience. A quick raise of hands. Who believes we are living through a very dangerous time in history? Throw up your hand. All right. So we wanted to be optimistic in this session, but at the moment things are very grim. We've referenced conflicts. Wars have been a constant throughout human history, but we have seen from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, hitting nearly its 2-year anniversary, to the conflict in Israel and Gaza. How is anyone, when things are unfolding fast, that even media companies are struggling to keep up with the verification and the debunking, how is anyone here, anyone in the world, able to know what is fact or not?
There's two interesting parts to this question. So one of the interesting parts is, the rise of social media was this idea that you're removing gatekeepers. Because gatekeepers, again, historically, in history, people with money, with power, were able to have their voices heard. Others were not. So the idea of social media is that anyone could have their voices heard. But we kind of forgot that there is a role for gatekeeping to play around information, that mainstream journalists, they may get things wrong once in a while, but they at least make an effort to try to track this down, to vet it, to verify it. On social media, it's, oh, look, some random rumor over here. Here, I'll amplify that to my community. And so I think that that's a really, really scary thing. Now, one interesting aside to this, for those that saw my talk yesterday, I had a slide of global media tone over the last quarter century. And what's interesting is, up until the 90s, tone was pretty stable. In the 1990s, you see this odd inflection period, and then it just plunges to negativity. And Stephen Pinker actually uses this in his book. Whether the world's becoming more negative or whether it's the media, what happened in the 90s was the rise of web-based news. That all of a sudden, every media outlet on the planet was competing with every media outlet on the planet. So that's when you start seeing a real surge towards more negativity, more sensationalist language. And so when we talk about social media breaking the world, it's actually globalization, that the globalization of information, this access to information. But also, you think about, if a newspaper today tells me, hey, this just happened, and they've vetted and verified it in professionals, but I go on Twitter and I see all this other information, I'm going to say, hey, they're censoring it. I have access to the real information that's, the truth. And I think this is a really important point. And one of the ways that I think that we can address some of these is what we call a "you are here" map of the media. And so yesterday in my presentation, I showed these giant diagrams where we scooped up information from all across the planet, one day of global news coverage, and we basically made this diagram. And so you can actually zoom all the way into that and see where a particular story sat on a given day. I had an example of COVID vaccines, and so you can actually see these falsehoods emerge. Now, what's interesting is you can actually drill in there and you could see and say, here's where my information is sitting. Now, if you are someone who's very partisan and hardened in your beliefs, the fact that that's over here, way away from everything else, that's not going to dissuade you. But at least you will know where you sit in that landscape, and you will see, hey, everybody else is over here. Now, that might harden your views, but you see it. But if you're not, if you're not on either of those extremes, you can see, hey, I have this information. I don't know if it's real or not. Now, let's say it's breaking information, so no one yet knows whether it's real. You can kind of see where it's sitting, where it's trending, where it's kind of flowing in that. And that, to me, is really I think information literacy, I think, is a real key to this, which is that flood of information. Information just pouring out there. no amount of journalists in the world will be able to review every single piece of information that's out there, especially with the rise of cell phones out there. Everyone's just pouring out information. But where this gets really interesting is if I teach you, you think about this idea of if you were taught, if we teach children in schools how to think about information quickly, to say, hey, here's a tweet, and not retweet that, but actually sit down and evaluate that and say, so where does this come from? What's the motivation of this person? I think this is a really key point.
And that's a very useful tip for our audience as well, because as we've seen since the horrific October 7th attacks on the Israeli kibbutzes, the amount of disinformation and misinformation across social media has grown exponentially and has become very, very difficult. Now, we're running out of time, and so I wanted to ask you, what worries you the most at the moment? You're an optimistic guy. We've hung out for a little bit now. What keeps you up at night? What are you most worried about?
I think it's really the flood of AI-generated falsehoods across the world. The fact that all this information can just pour out there, and we don't really have, we can no longer hold back the flood. We really, really need the idea of basically society being able to combat this information themselves.
All right. On that note, a big round of applause for Kalev. Thank you so much for your insights. And thank you to
so
all
much.
of you for joining us this afternoon. Have a great rest of the event.
Thank you so much.
I think it's to the right.